In the shadows of war, beneath the banners of victory parades and carefully curated textbooks, lies a world deliberately erased. The title before us, 4 WWII Secrets Buried in Shadows of the Past, is not a headline but a sealed dossier, the kind pulled from steel cabinets inside intelligence vaults, stamped most restricted and circulated only among men who never left paper trails. It is a title that suggests not only forgotten events, but a deliberate act of concealment, a struggle by nations to bury truths that threatened their own survival after the guns fell silent. The public was told a story of liberation and justice, of good prevailing against the monstrous designs of the Axis. Yet inside classified memoranda, whispered through the archives of Moscow, London, Berlin, and Washington, another narrative emerges, one of silent bargains, suppressed atrocities, erased witnesses, and experiments so grotesque they were traded like currency during the birth of the Cold War. Every secret is a fracture line running beneath the official history, each one a forbidden scar revealing the price of victory. What you are about to hear is not a story polished for remembrance, but fragments torn from classified records. Fragments dangerous enough that both victors and defeated tried to bury them forever. Chapter 1. Classified Atrocities Beneath Operation Barbarossa. The invasion of the Soviet Union, launched on 22 June 1941 under the codename Operation Barbarossa, has long been recorded as the largest military offensive in human history. More than 3 million German troops crossed into Soviet territory in a single night, supported by panzer divisions, Luftwaffe squadrons, and carefully orchestrated supply lines. The public record shows tanks, artillery, and mass encirclements. But behind these battlefield operations lay a second, more sinister campaign, classified operations executed not for conquest of land, but for the systematic erasure of identity, leadership, and cultural resistance. Hidden within the Wehrmacht's vast invasion force were specialized detachments, many attached to the Reich Main Security Office, or RSHA. These were not frontline units. They bore designations like Einsatzkommando Nachtigall and Sonderkommando Bergbau. Their directives were precise. Eliminate intellectuals, political figures, priests, and teachers in newly occupied territories. In towns across Galicia, Ukraine, and Belarus, these units worked with chilling efficiency. Survivors later recalled trucks arriving at dawn, lists in hand, and names read aloud before entire families vanished into forests and ravines. Few of these killings were documented in Nuremberg proceedings, for they were categorized not as crimes of war, but as matters of intelligence, operations buried in sealed annexes. The Soviet Union, on the other side of the front, committed parallel atrocities under the authority of the NKVD. Their classified files, many marked Osobo Ważno, translated as of special importance, describe purges carried out against entire villages suspected of collaborating with German forces. These were not acts of defense but calculated erasures designed to prevent German exploitation of local populations. A 1942 NKVD directive ordered complete liquidation of suspected collaborators in border zones, including women and children, to deny the enemy any sympathetic elements. Like the German files, these Soviet documents were excluded from public war crimes trials. To admit their existence would have undermined the moral framework of Allied victory. Some of the most disturbing evidence emerges from Polish underground archives, preserved despite German and Soviet attempts at destruction. Reports smuggled through the Home Army described mass killings in Lviv, where both Nachtigall units and NKVD detachments operated simultaneously, each eliminating figures considered dangerous to their own regimes. University professors were executed, Catholic clergy disappeared, and Jewish community leaders were targeted by both sides for entirely different reasons. The result was the systematic destruction of civil society, carried out under the shadow of conventional warfare. American and British intelligence were not blind to these operations, intercepted German communications under the code name Ultra reveal that London knew of targeted killings as early as August 1941, yet the information was deemed unsuitable for dissemination. The files were locked away, buried under layers of secrecy, for Allied governments feared publicizing atrocities that might also expose Soviet crimes. Winston Churchill himself, in a memorandum dated September 1941, noted that the revelations were best left for after the war. After the war came, however, The files remained locked, their potential to destabilize post-war alliances too great. Nuremberg represented itself as the tribunal of truth, but even within those chambers silence prevailed. The atrocities of the Einsatzgruppen were prosecuted in broad terms, but references to coordinated intellectual purges and NKVD parallel actions were redacted from transcripts. Western prosecutors wanted to avoid Soviet embarrassment, while Moscow, in turn, ensured no reference was made to its own campaigns of liquidation. The trial records thus became another weapon in the concealment of history. Survivors who tried to testify about NKVD massacres in Galicia were dismissed or quietly silenced. Their accounts catalogued in internal files never made public. The numbers remained contested, but scattered documents suggest that tens of thousands, professors, clergy, local officials, were eliminated in the first months of Operation Barbarossa. In some cases, German and Soviet forces alternated control of towns, each repeating the cycle of erasure. A name crossed out by the Germans might later be crossed out again by the Soviets, until there was nothing left but silence. These victims did not fit into post-war categories of Holocaust, partisan warfare, or military loss. They became shadows erased from both memory and justice. The cover-up extended into the Cold War. When West German historians in the 1960s began uncovering Einsatzgruppen orders, Soviet archives remained closed. Requests for access to NKVD files were denied on grounds of state security. In Poland, communist authorities forbade discussion of massacres committed under Stalin's orders, while Western governments avoided pressing the issue for fear of destabilizing NATO's fragile alliances. The victims remained unacknowledged, their graves unmarked, their stories hidden behind classified seals. Testimonies smuggled from gulags added fragments to the record. In the 1950s, Polish exiles published accounts of professors in Lviv executed by German commandos, while Soviet security simultaneously purged other segments of the intelligentsia. These testimonies were dismissed as propaganda at the time, yet later declassified files confirm their accuracy. Even today, many archives remain only partially opened, with key sections redacted. The truth, long suppressed, reveals a disturbing symmetry between two regimes officially at war, yet united in one silent goal: the eradication of voices that might resist occupation. The psychological weight of these revelations lies not only in the killings themselves, but in the deliberate erasure of memory. Families of the disappeared were forced to live under regimes that denied their loss, forbidden from mourning or asking questions. The silence became a second form of violence. To study these events now is to confront not just the brutality of the acts, but the machinery of secrecy that allowed them to vanish from the record for decades. Operation Barbarossa is remembered as the clash of armies and ideologies, but its deeper legacy lies in the hidden atrocities conducted under its shadow. The front lines stretched across thousands of kilometers, yet behind them unfolded another war, one fought with lists, secret orders, and silent executions. It is a war without monuments, where the victims remain faceless, their stories written only in fragments smuggled across borders and rediscovered in archives. The official histories will continue to speak of battles and victories, but the truth of classified atrocities beneath Operation Barbarossa lingers like a wound, sealed but never healed. And as long as the files remain incomplete, the question of how much was deliberately erased will haunt every retelling of the Eastern Front. Chapter 2. Forbidden Experiments Within Unit 731. Silence. In the remote plains of occupied Manchuria, outside the industrial city of Harbin, stood a compound officially labeled the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. Behind its walls, beyond the watchtowers and electrified fences, operated Unit 731, a facility whose true purpose was far darker than its sterile title suggested. From 1937 until Japan's surrender in 1945, this clandestine laboratory became a site of atrocities so grotesque that they would rival the worst crimes of the century, and yet most of the world never heard their full extent. For the records were buried, the perpetrators shielded, and the victims consigned to silence. Unit 731 was commanded by Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, a brilliant microbiologist with an ambition to transform warfare. His vision was not of bombs or artillery, but of microbes as weapons. Under his direction, Japanese scientists experimented with plague, cholera, typhus, and anthrax. Human subjects, known in records as maruta, or logs, were prisoners of war, political dissidents, and civilians forcibly taken from villages. They were exposed to pathogens through injections, contaminated food, and even airdropped fleas bred to carry bubonic plague. Some were dissected alive without anesthesia, their organs removed while their hearts still beat. In the pursuit of scientific data, the atrocities did not end with disease. Records describe frostbite experiments in which prisoners were forced to stand in sub-zero temperatures until their limbs froze solid. Guards then struck the limbs with sticks to measure the sound of ice crystals breaking inside flesh before amputating without anesthetic. Pregnant women were deliberately infected to study maternal transmission. Prisoners were exposed to flamethrowers, grenades, and pressure chambers designed to replicate combat injuries. Each body was treated as a disposable data point, erased from record once the experiment concluded. The Soviet Union discovered fragments of this horror when it occupied Manchuria in August 1945. Red Army investigators uncovered laboratories, cages, and documents left behind in Ishi's hasty evacuation. In Khabarovsk, a military tribunal convened in December 1949 exposed part of the truth. Testimonies detailed plague bombs tested in Chinese villages and mass infection of civilians. Yet the tribunal records, though public in the USSR, were dismissed in the West as propaganda. What was less known was that Washington already held its own secret deal. In Tokyo, General Douglas MacArthur and US intelligence officers faced a choice. The atrocities of Unit 731 were undeniable, but the data collected represented years of research in biological warfare, research the United States had not yet achieved. Rather than prosecute Ishi and his colleagues, the US struck a bargain. Under the codename Paperclip East, American officers offered immunity in exchange for exclusive access to the findings. By 1947, Ishi was quietly relocated, shielded from trial, and his data transferred to Fort Detrick in Maryland, where the US Army's biological warfare program began to flourish. Reports on flea-borne plague dispersal and survivability of anthrax spores entered American archives, stripped of their human cost. Soviet intelligence followed its own path. Several captured Unit 731 scientists, including Major General Kiyoshi Kawashima, were transported to Siberia. There, under NKVD supervision, they continued research in secret laboratories. Documents declassified in the 1990s reveal Soviet efforts to replicate plague bombs and anthrax dispersal methods. Unlike the Americans, the Soviets publicized selected evidence to condemn Japan, but they too shielded certain specialists from execution, preserving their expertise for Cold War competition. The silence was deliberate. At the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the so-called Tokyo trials, references to Unit 731 were minimized. Judges focused on crimes of aggression and atrocities against prisoners of war, but avoided the full scope of biological warfare. Official transcripts mention medical experiments in vague terms, with key testimonies suppressed. Behind closed doors, US prosecutors struck out lines that might implicate their own intelligence operations. Victims and witnesses who attempted to testify were excluded. The tribunal became not a forum of truth, but another layer of concealment. What makes this secret so disturbing is not only the brutality of the experiments, but the complicity of powers that claimed moral victory in 1945. American officials justified the bargain with Ishi as a necessity in the emerging Cold War, a race against Soviet capabilities. Yet the cost of this decision was the erasure of thousands of victims, mostly Chinese civilians, whose suffering was reduced to redacted paragraphs and classified appendices. Their names never entered official war crimes records. Their graves remain unmarked across Manchuria, concealed beneath fields and riverbanks. Some survivors carried fragments of memory into the post-war years. Farmers in Zhejiang province remembered entire villages infected by strange outbreaks after Japanese aircraft released ceramic bombs filled with fleas. Families recalled forced quarantines, bodies burned in mass pits, and officials who never explained what had happened. For decades, these testimonies were dismissed as rumor. Only in the late 1980s, with the opening of certain Japanese and American archives, did the scale of Unit 731 begin to emerge. Even then, much remained sealed, classified under national security. The scientific records of Unit 731, sanitized and stripped of context, influenced Cold War research. At Fort Detrick, US scientists tested aerosol dispersal of anthrax spores, echoing Ishii's earlier findings. In Sverdlovsk, Soviet laboratories expanded their plague and smallpox programs, drawing upon data captured in Manchuria. Neither side admitted that their knowledge was rooted in atrocity. The victims had been transformed into invisible collaborators in a global arms race they never consented to join. The moral consequences are staggering. Justice was traded for science. Truth was buried for strategic advantage. Nations that proclaimed victory over fascism adopted its methods in secret. The very idea of war crimes lost meaning when atrocities could be excused, erased, or commodified. Unit 731 became not only a symbol of Japanese militarism, but of the corruption of justice in the pursuit of power. The silence continues even now. Japanese textbooks barely mention Unit 731. American archives retain thousands of pages still redacted. Russian records remain incomplete, with key testimonies missing. Survivors, now elderly, continue to demand recognition, their voices often ignored. Each year that passes deepens the shadows around this history, reinforcing the deliberate forgetting engineered in 1945. To examine Unit 731 is to confront not only the horrors of wartime science, but the fragility of truth itself. How much of history has been shaped not by revelation, but by suppression? How many victims remain unacknowledged because their suffering proved useful to powerful states? The silence around Unit 731 is not accidental. It is a silence purchased, protected, and perpetuated by those who feared the consequences of full disclosure. It stands as one of the darkest secrets of World War II, buried in classified files, whispered in broken testimonies, and carried like a forbidden stain into the Cold War. And though the compound at Harbin has crumbled, its shadows remain, stretching across the decades like an unending echo of what humanity chose to hide. Chapter 3: Hidden Pact Behind Dresden's Firestorm. On the night of 13th of February 1945, as Europe's war neared its end, the skies above the Saxon city of Dresden ignited. British and American bombers dropped wave after wave of incendiaries, reducing the city to an inferno. Tens of thousands of civilians were incinerated, suffocated, or buried alive. Official history has long described this destruction as a strategic effort to cripple German transport and morale. Yet buried in classified files concealed for decades lies evidence of another purpose, a hidden pact forged in secrecy that turned Dresden into both target and message. The Yalta Conference had concluded only days before, with Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin dividing the map of Europe into spheres of influence. Beyond public communiques of cooperation, private memoranda reveal simmering distrust. British Air Ministry documents marked "Most Secret" under the codename Operation Thunderclap outlined plans for overwhelming bombing raids, not solely to damage German logistics, but to demonstrate overwhelming air power to our Soviet allies. The language, cold and clinical, suggests an intent that reached beyond military necessity. Dresden, a cultural center with minimal defenses and little strategic value, was chosen precisely because its destruction would be impossible to ignore. Soviet observers stationed in London were invited to witness the planning. Intercepts from NKVD agents report British officials speaking of a gesture Stalin cannot misinterpret. The scale of the attack, thousands of tons of high explosives followed by waves of incendiaries, was designed to leave the city a smoldering ruin visible from reconnaissance flights. When the Red Army entered Dresden weeks later, they walked not into a liberated city, but into a charnel house, proof of Anglo-American supremacy in the skies. The hidden bargain was simple. By sacrificing Dresden, the Western Allies secured Stalin's silence in other regions. Soviet records, declassified after 1991, reveal a telegram from Molotov to Stalin, noting that the Allies intend to claim Greece and the Balkans without interference. Stalin's response was curt but telling. Let them have their fireworks. Our focus remains on Berlin. Dresden's firestorm was thus not only a military operation, but a diplomatic transaction, a city offered as a demonstration, ensuring Soviet acquiescence in territories outside their immediate grasp. Inside Dresden, the consequences were apocalyptic. Survivors spoke of firestorms so intense that bodies were lifted into the air, pulled into flames by the sheer force of oxygen rushing into the inferno. Cellars became ovens as temperatures climbed past survivable limits. Historical accounts vary, but estimates of the dead range from 25,000 to more than 100,000. Entire families vanished without record, their ashes mingling with rubble. Official casualty figures, sanitized after the war, downplayed the devastation. British and American communiqué referred vaguely to severe damage to transportation hubs. The truth was withheld, censored even from many in government. Churchill himself revealed the unease in a memorandum dated 28th of March 1945, in which he described the destruction of Dresden as a serious query against the conduct of Allied bombing. Yet this memo was later revised, softened in tone, and eventually excised from published volumes of his war memoirs. The original draft, found decades later in British archives, exposes a leader aware that Dresden's destruction had exceeded strategic justification. His doubt was buried, much like the city itself. American files paint a similar picture. After-action reports from the US Army Air Forces included references to demonstrative raids for political effect. These lines were quietly struck from declassified summaries released in the 1950s. When questioned publicly, American commanders insisted Dresden was a legitimate target, citing railway lines and communication centers. Yet reconnaissance photos taken days after the raid show those facilities largely intact. The cultural heart of Dresden, however, its Baroque architecture, museums, and homes had been annihilated. The Soviets, for their part, weaponized Dresden's ruins for propaganda while concealing their role in the Pact. In the late 1940s, East German publications denounced the bombing as Anglo-American barbarism, portraying the Western Allies as war criminals. What they omitted was Stalin's foreknowledge, his tacit consent to the raid in exchange for unchallenged control over Poland, Hungary, and beyond. The victims of Dresden became pawns in a larger struggle, their suffering instrumentalized by both sides while the truth remained classified. The Cold War deepened the silence. Western governments suppressed debate, framing criticism of Dresden as enemy propaganda. Historians who questioned the official narrative faced censure, their access to archives restricted. Documents remained sealed under national security labels for decades. Only after the fall of the Soviet Union did scattered records confirm the existence of the hidden bargain. NKVD cables, Foreign Office memoranda, and Air Ministry drafts together reveal a narrative of calculation rather than necessity. Dresden's destruction must therefore be seen not as a military operation alone, but as an act of geopolitical theatre. The flames were meant to illuminate power, to remind Stalin that Western bombers could incinerate cities at will. The price was paid in civilian lives, erased in the service of diplomacy. What makes this secret unbearable is the cold arithmetic at its core, that a city could be chosen not for its strategic value, but for its symbolic worth in a negotiation invisible to those beneath the falling bombs. To walk through Dresden today is to see reconstruction, monuments, and silence. Plaques recall the night of fire, but official inscriptions avoid the language of political bargain. The victims remain caught between histories, used by the East as propaganda, dismissed by the West as regrettable, but justified. The classified records suggest otherwise. Dresden was not only a tragedy of war, but a message in flames, a signal sent across conference tables and buried beneath communiques. The shadows surrounding Dresden's firestorm remind us that even in the war's final months, when victory seemed inevitable, human lives remained expendable currency in the great game of power. The destruction was not simply a blow against Nazism, but a rehearsal for the post-war order. It was the moment when Allied cooperation gave way to competition, and the Cold War was foreshadowed not in treaties, but in fire. Dresden burned so that lines on maps could be drawn with less resistance, and the silence that followed ensured that those flames would smolder, unseen, in classified archives for generations. Chapter 4: Erased Missions of the Ghost Convoys. The Arctic convoys of World War II are remembered as lifelines, fleets of merchant ships braving U-boat wolf packs, Luftwaffe bombers, and deadly ice to deliver vital supplies from Britain and the United States to the Soviet Union. Between 1941 and 1945, thousands of sailors endured the frozen seas of the Barents and Kara, carrying tanks, aircraft, fuel, and food to sustain the Red Army's desperate resistance. Official histories recount the heroism of these men, their ships sailing under codenames like PQ-17 or JW-51, often with catastrophic losses. Yet buried beneath this familiar story lies another, darker record, secret shipments erased from manifests, missions that never appeared in official logs, convoys that slipped through the ice without acknowledgement. These were the ghost convoys, hidden beneath codenames and sealed files. Their existence suppressed for reasons far more explosive than military secrecy. British Admiralty documents declassified in the late 20th century reveal references to cargoes, marked red ink, shipments whose details were deliberately omitted from convoy records. Unlike the well-documented deliveries of Spitfires, Valentine tanks, or canned meat, these consignments contained experimental radar systems, chemical precursors, and, most disturbingly, small amounts of enriched uranium and heavy water. The purpose, as later fragments suggest, was to accelerate Soviet research into nuclear weapons. To protect the secrecy, entire crews were bound by the Official Secrets Act, forbidden from recording details even in private diaries. Those who broke silence faced court-martial or worse. For decades, the very existence of these cargoes was denied, erased from naval histories with bureaucratic precision. Testimonies from surviving sailors speak of ghost ships within the convoys, merchantmen that sailed under blackout, without identification, often diverted mid-route to Murmansk or Archangel by coded signals. Some disappeared entirely, torpedoed by U-boats whose own logs curiously omitted the engagements. Others arrived in Soviet ports only to vanish into restricted naval zones, their cargo offloaded under NKVD guard. Sailors recalled unloading crates sealed with lead stamps bearing not British marks, but codenames like Project Boreas or Red Ink 2. When they asked questions, officers told them these supplies did not exist. Official convoy reports, submitted to Parliament and Congress, made no mention of the missing ships. Churchill himself was aware. A memorandum dated October 1942, stamped Most Secret, notes, certain consignments to the Soviet Union of special scientific nature are not to be included in Admiralty summaries. The memorandum warns of grave consequences should knowledge of these transfers reach the Americans or Parliament. The implication is clear. Britain was supplying Stalin with materials that could shape the post-war balance of power, while keeping its own allies in the dark. For Churchill, the calculation was survival, ensuring Soviet endurance against Hitler, regardless of the future cost. But the erasure of these missions planted the seeds of nuclear rivalry even before the Cold War began. American officials eventually discovered fragments of the truth. Reports from OSS agents in Murmansk noted unusual shipments arriving under heavy Soviet guard, including crates too small to be tanks or aircraft. By 1944, intelligence memos suggested Britain was transferring sensitive technology without US oversight. Yet Washington, locked in alliance, chose not to confront London openly. After 1945, when the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb, suspicions resurfaced. Some in the Pentagon whispered that the bomb was not solely a product of Soviet espionage, but also of wartime shipments quietly erased from convoy logs. These suspicions were never admitted publicly, but classified investigations continued into the 1950s, combing through records that had already been deliberately cleansed. The ghost convoys left another, more human cost. Families of sailors lost on erased missions never received full answers. Ships recorded as lost to enemy action sometimes had no U-boat claim against them. Survivors who returned found their service unrecognized, their records missing or stamped classified. One British sailor, interviewed decades later, recalled being threatened with prison when he tried to tell his story of unloading crates marked with radiation warnings. His testimony was dismissed as delusion until declassified files proved the existence of restricted shipments. By then, most of his comrades were gone, their memories buried with them. The Soviet side maintained its own secrecy. NKVD records describe special deliveries arriving under convoy escort, immediately diverted to closed institutes in Moscow and Sverdlovsk. Documents marked not to be translated confirm that shipments of deuterium oxide and specialized measuring instruments were received as early as 1943. These contributions, though small compared to espionage efforts like those of Klaus Fuchs and the Rosenbergs, accelerated Soviet nuclear research. Yet for decades, Moscow denied any Western assistance, while London and Washington denied having supplied it. The ghost convoys became a secret both sides found convenient to forget. The erasure was meticulous. Official British convoy records were scrubbed of inconsistencies, leaving gaps where ships simply vanished. Admiralty historians in the 1950s were instructed, to omit references to special cargoes. Survivors, who pressed for recognition of their service, were told that certain missions did not occur. When declassified fragments emerged in the 1990s, they revealed only glimpses, redacted manifests, references to sensitive shipments, and Churchill's memoranda. The full story remains hidden, locked in vaults under the Official Secrets Act, with release dates pushed further into the future. The ghost convoys illustrate how alliances of necessity can sow seeds of future conflict. By supplying Stalin with tools for nuclear research, Britain ensured immediate wartime survival, but contributed to the arms race that would later threaten its very existence. By erasing these missions from history, governments denied recognition to the men who risked, and often lost, their lives carrying cargoes too dangerous to acknowledge. The convoys were presented as symbols of unity, yet within them sailed ships destined never to be remembered, their missions buried in silence. Today, fragments of wrecks still lie beneath Arctic waters, hulks of merchantmen and escorts lost in erased battles, their presence unexplained in official logs. Divers have reported finding sealed containers among the debris, their contents corroded but still radioactive. If true, these wrecks are the final testimony to missions denied by governments for generations. The Arctic, vast and silent, holds the graves of sailors who carried secrets too great for history to admit. The erased missions of the ghost convoys are not simply footnotes of war. They are reminders of how survival can demand betrayal, how truth can be sacrificed for advantage, and how the lives of men can be written out of history by a single red stamp marked classified. The convoys are remembered as heroes of the frozen sea, but within their ranks sailed ghost ships, unacknowledged, unrecorded, and erased. Their story, buried beneath ice and secrecy, lingers still in the shadows of the past. In the end, WWII's Secrets Buried in Shadows of the Past is not just a title, but a warning. Each chapter torn from the archives exposes a truth carefully concealed. Atrocities committed in the name of ideology, experiments excused in the name of science, cities sacrificed in the name of diplomacy, and convoys erased in the name of survival. Together, they form a mosaic of betrayal, where justice was traded, alliances were bartered, and memory itself was manipulated. These were not accidents of war, nor isolated crimes, but deliberate choices, carried out by leaders who understood the cost and buried the evidence beneath seals marked most restricted. What lingers today are fragments, declassified memos, intercepted cables, testimonies whispered before death, that hint at a far darker ledger of the Second World War than the public was ever allowed to see. And so we are left with unresolved questions. How many more files remain locked in vaults? How many voices were silenced before they could testify? How many truths lie waiting in the shadows of history? Perhaps the final secret is this, that the war we think we know is only half the story, and the other half is still buried, waiting to be uncovered.